Some days dress themselves in the costume of routine, hoping no one notices the shift behind their eyes. But every so often, a day arrives that has no interest in blending in. It doesn't knock or introduce itself. It reroutes the rhythm without permission. Most will mistake it for a hiccup in the usual, a mood swing of the cosmos, but its nature is far more intentional. It's a setup disguised as a moment. While calendars pretend to be neutral, time sometimes conspires with the unseen. The majority won't sense the pivot until the echo is already fading. Those who've rolled their eyes at the idea that invisible forces could have architecture might soon find themselves quieted, not by belief, but by experience. Subscribe, not for more content, but for more clarity. There are patterns waiting to be recognized in the things that once seemed random. This is when contradictions stop arguing and start syncing up. Whatever governs the structure of meaning doesn't wait for consent. By the time questions form, the answer has already rearranged the entire room. And yet, the most crucial movement isn't loud, it's subtle, like the breath just before a truth reveals itself. It's already started. Not tomorrow. Not later. Now. But here's the trick. Blink at the wrong moment, and the signal slips through the cracks. Ever noticed how some changes don't make a sound, but still manage to wake something up in the bones? The question is, did something already start shifting while attention was elsewhere? Something about the air lately has felt less like guidance and more like insistence. It's not suggesting a fresh start, it's pressing against the wall just hard enough for it to open where it once seemed solid. And there's no ceremony to mark it, no symbolic act to dramatize the shift. The change is already breathing through the cracks. Not loud, not grand, just precise. So quiet, in fact, it risks being missed by anyone waiting for a thunderclap. What if the moment before everything changes feels exactly like the moment when nothing appears to be happening? There's a strange choreography underway, events syncing with thoughts, ideas finding companions in the most unlikely places. The instinct might be to brush it off as randomness, but the odds are stacking too neatly. One pattern too many, one door too well-timed. The repeating notion that keeps surfacing? It's not harmless background noise. It's rhythm disguised as memory. And once that's seen, can it ever be unseen? What if the shortcut didn't look like a door at all, but more like a shadow that moves before the body does? There's a certain kind of knowing that doesn't arrive with words. It arrives with motion. A truth so subtle it enters through the fingertips before it ever knocks on the mind. This isn't a time for diagrams or decoding. It's a time to move, before the reason for moving becomes clear. That internal nudge, the tilt in the chest, the quick breath before commitment, that's the signal. And maybe it's worth asking, when was the last time clarity came before action, instead of after? Moments like this don't wait for spreadsheets or guarantees. They wait for willingness. Not the kind that comes from courage, but the kind that comes from surrendering to a pulse that doesn't need explaining. Readiness, in this case, is more vibration than logic. It shows up as a tension between what's known and what's possible, and it's usually felt before it's understood. If the heart speeds up for no reason, if the thoughts skip a beat, if the decision suddenly feels heavier than it should, could that be the sign? Or is it just another echo asking not to be ignored? There are moments when time feels less like a line and more like a window carved into silence, brief, narrow, and vanishing before the breath fully catches up. Those who hesitate tend to see it close without a sound, while those who leap, sometimes clumsily, seem to land on tiles that weren't there a moment ago. Strangely, it's not recklessness that's being rewarded, it's surrender. The kind of surrender that trusts the rhythm without demanding a map. Something rare is unfolding, and it isn't messy. It's surgical. Lately, it feels like something is quietly sorting through timelines, magnetizing the ones who treat alignment like a present reality, not a future fantasy. Waiting for proof seems to disqualify presence. It's as if movement itself becomes the currency of this moment, an exchange made not in plans, but in willingness. And somehow, every step taken without certainty seems to trigger the next stone to appear. Is that just faith? Or is the architecture of destiny more interactive than previously assumed? But there's a catch tucked in the folds of this acceleration. What's unfolding isn't randomness, it's resonance. There's no glitter falling from nowhere, no miraculous deposit without intention. The shift is in how the lock responds to presence. For the first time, what was sealed isn't being forced open, it's recognizing something in the vibration and yielding on its own. The treasure isn't new. What's new is the moment it stops pretending to be out of reach. Still, it's not all ease. There's friction too, subtle, but exact. Not external, but internal. A pattern in the circuitry of thought, a reflex in the voice that talks during quiet moments. This moon, or whatever force is disguising itself as a lunar influence, isn't throwing coins from the sky, it's flipping switches behind the walls. It reveals itself in strange fragments, a phrase overheard in a podcast, a strange pull during a casual task, a half-thought that grows roots out of nowhere. What do those moments know that we don't? Then there's the moment the illusion breaks. The inherited belief, the one that whispers, "That's for other people," or "Success means struggle first," begins to dissolve under its own weight. Suddenly, it doesn't hold. It can't. It feels tired, like an outfit worn long after the season changed. This isn't about chasing anything falling from the clouds. It's about turning around and realizing the key was on the table the whole time, but previously looked like something else. Is that realization enough to reroute an entire future? Clarity has a strange way of arriving. Not as a sunrise, but as a flicker in the hallway, a word, a glance, an unassuming message that suddenly fits perfectly. That's when the invisible becomes obvious. That's when the shape of the path becomes clear. Not because it was drawn, but because the eyes finally adjusted. What once felt like a fog now feels like a map. Wealth, it turns out, isn't handed out. It's remembered, like a name nearly forgotten but instantly familiar once heard again. Not every account fills overnight, but the silence does shift. And when it does, the distance between now and possibility begins to collapse. There comes a point where resistance doesn't break, it just moves. Like a hand that once blocked the way but now slips quietly into a pocket, no longer interested in guarding the same old doubts. Something internal has simply grown tired of saying no, and without ceremony, the barrier dissolves. Not because anything external changed, but because the energy that once denied access isn't holding the gate anymore. If something has started feeling oddly available, maybe it was never about readiness, it was about permission being silently revoked from an outdated fear. Once that internal freeze begins to thaw, the momentum isn't content to stay in one area. It spreads. It calls in shifts that extend beyond the expected, touching relationships, ideas, even the structure of ordinary days. And yes, it may arrive looking like collapse, but it isn't decay, it's decoding. The old systems shake as the deeper ones rise. When everything starts moving at once, don't be alarmed. That disarray. It's precision without polish. It just hasn't finished reassembling itself yet. What's appearing now might seem like static, awkward interactions, delayed replies, unexpected friction in places that were once smooth. But perhaps this is the clarity that can't arrive quietly. Perhaps the noise is the sorting process. And maybe the question isn't, what's wrong with this? But, what's no longer aligned? The urge to intervene, to smooth it over, to decode it on the spot, that's an old reflex. Maybe it's time to let the tension speak before rushing to silence it. Unfamiliar discomfort isn't always a sign something went wrong. It's often just the skin no longer fitting the shape it's meant to contain. Shifts in schedule, conversations gone flat, connections dissolving faster than expected, these aren't glitches. They're edits. What's being removed isn't meant to be mourned. It's being released because it belongs to a version of life that couldn't carry forward. If nothing fits, maybe the fit was never real, just tolerated. Something is adjusting reality in real time. Not out of cruelty, not for chaos, but for accuracy. That discomfort pressing at the seams, it's not an error. It's the heat caused by shedding speed that no longer serves the current direction. And no, it won't ask for consent. It arrives with its own intelligence. A timing that doesn't wait to be understood before unfolding. It's already underway. And part of the challenge is this. Can resistance be exchanged for reverence, even before it makes sense? The disruptions arriving now aren't reckless. They're curated. The threads being cut are the ones that were quietly draining strength. Patterns that once offered comfort are now unraveling because comfort became a cage. And what's being removed? It couldn't hold the new shape forming. So rather than collapse, consider this. Is it possible this is a recalibration dressed in mess? Could the breakdown be the opening act of the breakthrough? New thoughts are arriving from odd directions. Priorities are turning inside out. What once felt urgent now feels irrelevant, and what was once dismissed keeps circling back with insistence. The shift is so subtle it might be mistaken for distraction. But what if that offhand idea is the real thread? What if the detour is the path? The blueprint isn't broken. It's just redrawing itself under a different light, one that only reveals the next piece after movement begins. Sometimes clarity doesn't show up wearing symbols. Sometimes it's an interruption, a cancelled plan, a delayed response, a pause in momentum. That pause isn't dead air. It's a language of its own. And it's worth asking, what if this silence isn't absence, but realignment? If the interference is allowed to speak, what would it say? Sometimes the real message doesn't arrive as comfort. Sometimes it arrives as rupture, and the invitation to stop resisting the unfamiliar rhythm. What's on the other side of all this isn't a return to the familiar. It's a deeper level of precision. A knowing that no longer relies on speculation. And once it clicks, when that light finally hits the right angle, momentum takes over. Fast. But only for those who are no longer doubting what they're actually trying to build. Because in this space, clarity becomes its own form of currency. The new energy doesn't meander. It echoes instantly. It's no longer waiting for midnight rituals or candlelit wishes. Thought is the trigger now. Focus is the magnet. Intention doesn't pass through delay, it passes through reflection. And in that mirror, if the image is fuzzy, the result will be too. The echo always returns in the shape of the request. So here's the quiet warning tucked into the noise. Speak with precision, or risk receiving an answer that's just as vague. This moment doesn't ask for scattered intention or vague desire. It demands precision. Not the kind measured by logic, but by resonance. What's unfolding isn't about sending wishes into some blurry distance. It's about tuning the internal dial until it locks onto something real. This energy isn't soft focus. It's high definition. And whatever's radiating out will be returned just as clearly. Misalignment won't be filtered. It will be reflected, instantly and unedited. Desire shaped in uncertainty tends to echo itself. When the inner script carries hesitation, the response comes back with static. But when clarity sets in, something uncanny happens. The text arrives. The moment reveals itself. And readiness is no longer theoretical. It's required. The mirror doesn't care about intention, it responds to frequency. So the question becomes, what if the ask is bigger than expected? Can that be received without retreat? Clarity has become more than helpful. It's become the entry key. It's the invitation written in a language only action can read. And this energy doesn't speak in maybes or potentials. It follows instructions that are clean, definite, and unmistakably felt. There's nothing being magnetized here, it's resonance answering recognition. Because once the request matches the truth, it has nowhere else to go but forward. This shift carries a subtle distortion field. It doesn't change who anyone is, it just dissolves the layers that kept certain people from ever seeing clearly. The image once projected onto this identity begins to glitch. The blur lifts. And what was once misunderstood simply becomes visible. Not because the self changed, but because the audience did. Sometimes it's not evolution. Sometimes it's revelation. And when the fog lifts, the ones meant to stay don't look confused, they look focused. New recognition lands like a signal. Messages surface from places previously silent. An old acquaintance circles back with new eyes. Or a passing remark hits in a way that reconfigures something inside. This isn't coincidence. This is tuning. The pattern was always there. Now it's just being perceived correctly. What's real doesn't need to shout. The recognition now entering isn't always loud, but it's unmistakably true. It's in the way people suddenly listen instead of nodding. In how ideas are met with curiosity instead of correction. This isn't visibility for performance. It's clarity for connection. Because being seen isn't about being noticed, it's about being understood without translation. The air around this new phase isn't filled with spotlights. It's saturated with truth. The right faces begin to notice, not because of anything done, but because the frequency is finally right. These aren't casual connections. They're encoded, built to unlock the next stage. Collaborators, mentors, catalysts, all emerging from silence with the missing pieces already in hand. There's a rare quiet power in being seen by the right eyes. Not the noisy ones. The ones that feel like a key finally turning. This isn't validation. It's calibration. And once it begins, the past misunderstandings start to feel less personal and more like necessary delay. After all, when the wrong gaze lifts, the real one can finally land. Has that shift already begun? What was once dismissed as a passing thought now won't leave. A new subject pulls attention like gravity. An unexpected location begins to feel like memory. And the logic behind it. There may not be any. Not the usual kind, anyway. And yet, it makes sense in the bones. It vibrates somewhere deeper. Even if the mind argues, something else keeps nodding. What if the plan wasn't flawed, it was just waiting for permission? That new obsession isn't irrational. It's ancient. It's been waiting in the quiet corners, maturing behind the noise. The connections are forming faster. The signs aren't shy. And the sense of direction. It's not pressure, it's propulsion. This isn't coercion. It's invitation. And somehow, the invitation has been accepted without needing to be consciously read. Strangely, the goal was never stability. It just wore that mask. What's arriving now is movement that doesn't ache. A place that feels more like exhale than arrival. Work that flows instead of drains. Relationships that don't require translation. It may not match the vision previously held, but it matches the feeling that was secretly craved. And isn't that what alignment really is? When the unexpected tugs on the edge of awareness this week, let curiosity lead. Don't rush to label it. Trace it. Explore it. Let the impulse breathe. What's emerging now was never part of the conscious plan, but it's always been folded into the deeper one. And if that sounds familiar, maybe it's because the future isn't ahead. Maybe it's just finally catching up. Some closures don't happen with noise, they happen with motion. What once felt immovable begins to shift, not because something outside intervened, but because the ownership of the block is finally released. It was never internal. It was inherited, mistaken for identity. The delay, the loop, the familiar moment of almost but not quite, it starts to dissolve. Not slowly. Not gently. The wheel doesn't inch forward this time, it jerks into motion. Like something invisible finally let go of the brake. There's a certain rhythm that appears when energy clears. Not poetic, not abstract, but physical. Appointments stick. Replies land. People who were ghosts re-emerge, not out of nostalgia, but alignment. It's not optimism. It's movement. The kind that reclaims time as functional. Things start saying yes when no used to echo. And the shift isn't just felt, it's seen. Something is clicking, and no one needs to guess anymore. When movement becomes effortless, it's tempting to call it luck. But this isn't random. This is energy accumulated, finally dispersing. Not in sparks, but in patterns. It's the reward for unseen labor. The emotional upgrades that no one noticed. The work done in silence. And now, without spectacle, it breaks open. That meeting that suddenly works out, the answer that flows without resistance, it's not magic. It's velocity meeting timing. Progress doesn't always shout. Sometimes it lands in the middle of a sentence, or on the edge of a spontaneous idea. That email with the strange weight. That conversation that shifts midstream. It begins not with effort, but with permission. And that's the catch. Ease doesn't mean passivity. It means readiness has arrived. When movement begins, don't stall trying to interpret it. Let it carry. Let it guide. Let it reveal. This season brings something most people aren't taught to trust: ease in receiving. The mind, trained by chaos, assumes trouble is near when things unfold smoothly. But that hesitation isn't intuition, it's history. And now, that old armor begins to crack. Not as surrender, but as clarity. The sense of being on edge softens. And a subtle remembrance of worth begins to take its place. Confidence doesn't walk in loud. It arrives quietly, like recognition without explanation. The gestures shift, the language sharpens. No need to modify tone or translate intent. Something internal stops apologizing. Not out of rebellion, but because it's simply no longer necessary. And the strange part is, it doesn't feel like change. It feels like returning to a default that was hidden beneath layers. This confidence isn't performative. It doesn't preface itself. It doesn't dim or expand for approval. It just exists. And in that clarity, the parts that once overcompensated begin to retire. The version of self that monitored, edited, appeased, it loses control. Not in collapse, but in relief. Something more essential takes the reins. And suddenly, words land differently. Presence feels heavier. Space responds. Others notice before it registers internally. The shift is reflected first in their gaze, in the unspoken recalibration of how attention is given. Offers appear that were once unreachable. Conversations tilt toward respect without needing to be earned. This isn't a world adjusting, it's frequency sinking. And the shock comes not from the change, but from how natural it feels to no longer negotiate identity. The need to rehearse dissolves. The desire to package ideas to soften them, gone. What remains is speech without performance. And what echoes back is attention without confusion. When clarity becomes embodied, expression no longer seeks validation, it just states. It reveals. And in that simplicity, it becomes undeniable. Confidence isn't a tone. It's the absence of self-doubt in action. Sometimes change doesn't thunder in, it flickers quietly in behavior. A longer pause before responding. A calm refusal that doesn't need softening. A truth shared without rehearsing. These aren't declarations of power. They're subtle recalibrations of identity. The shape of self-trust often arrives like that, not loud, but steady. And when it shows up in these everyday gestures, something begins to shift externally too. The world, often deaf to explanation, starts to respond to embodiment instead. When desire loses its static, what's left is potent. That restless internal hum, jumping between fantasies, hedging bets, overthinking outcomes, begins to fade. Not because anything is forced quiet, but because something finally sharpens. A clearing occurs. Not external, but perceptual. A voice, once drowned in overchoice, starts whispering with strange clarity. And the craving for everything becomes a need for less, with precision. This isn't detachment, it's discernment. The fixation on outcomes softens not because they're no longer wanted, but because something more fitting takes their place. Priorities collapse into focus. The goalposts stop shifting. And what once seemed essential becomes oddly irrelevant. That's not failure, it's evolution. And what's curious is how familiar the new desire feels, like it's always been there, just buried under the noise of chasing too much. There comes a point when longing transforms into certainty. Not because the external aligned, but because the internal stopped negotiating. There's no more need to force doors open just to prove they exist. A quieter kind of confidence forms. One that only asks for the space it already knows how to fill. What remains isn't compromise. It's calibration. What stays is what resonates. And that resonance is unmistakable. The atmosphere now feels focused, almost surgical. The new energy doesn't wander. It pinpoints. It cuts away the distractions and demands honesty, not to punish, but to clarify. Once intention refines, things respond faster. Not because reality has changed, but because what's being asked is finally real. And maybe the question becomes, when clarity lands, can the unnecessary be released without grieving it? What's unfolding isn't chaos, it's accuracy. Not speed driven by effort, but momentum born from alignment. Actions become fewer but more effective. Conversations, shorter but more profound. Results, swifter but more grounded. It's not magic. It's mathematics. Input now echoes output with sharp symmetry. And that's why slowing down might actually accelerate things. Stillness is no longer stagnation, it's instruction. And in that stillness, a voice gets louder, not from outside, but within. The noise drops, and something more ancient speaks. That signal doesn't beg for approval. It just states. And when listened to, reality bends. Fast. Goals stop requiring pressure. Needs stop echoing as absence. And the space that opens up is where intuition steps in to build. Has that voice started speaking yet? What's it saying now that the volume has dropped? The strange part is how ease begins to feel earned. Not through struggle, but through subtraction. Less noise, less doubt, less urgency. And suddenly, there's space for things to arrive. The kind of arrival that doesn't need announcing. It just makes sense. And there, in that simplicity, is the proof. Power was never about doing more. It was about needing less.